Lost on the Red Hill by Evrim, Ersoy and Pentagram Home Video.
Just as the evening began to turn dark, I made my way to the hill to do some field recordings. It was a busy Sunday, and as I made my way along the path towards the top, there were still several people around out walking. Just before I reached the end of the path, I set up my equipment in a clearing that overlooked the coast. It was clouded and grey as the light faded, and the line of the shore wound south towards the horizon. It was quiet at this point, ideal for capturing the natural sound of the hill, which is what I'd hoped for, and I reckoned on having sufficient time to do some recording before it got dark. I could see the top of the hill from here, and by the time I had everything ready to record, I could see that I was now finally alone. It's at times like this that the mind recalls stories that are best left off the sides of lonely hills.
The guest at the window.
Not far from where I stood was a house, looked after by a friend of my father. He lived on his own. The house was owned by a religious order, and he was acting as caretaker. One evening, he turned his car into the long drive that leads to the large grey Victorian building and saw someone standing in the window. Thinking it was an aunt of his who would often visit him, and beyond the initial surprise of seeing someone at his window, he didn't think anything strange of it. Until he entered the house to find it empty. In those days, it wasn't unusual to leave a house unlocked. So he just made a mental note to lock the house up in future, thinking, it had to have been local teenagers, exploring. But a couple of nights later, as he turned into the driveway, the person was there again, at the window, waiting for him to get home. The door was locked, and there was, again, no one in the house. I'd passed this house in the early evening on the way to the hill, and it's empty now. Or possibly it just has the look of somewhere that will always seem empty. It certainly did have the feeling of an empty place when I eventually got to see it myself, with my father, a couple of weeks after his friend visited, telling us about more disturbances he'd experienced in the house. The guest had appeared one more time, standing in the top left window as he had arrived home. It was late autumn, and the evenings were getting shorter, so it was dark as the car turned into the driveway. This time, it was just as he was about to drive past the front of the house that faced out onto the road to park at the rear of the building that he looked up and saw the shape of the person leaning into the window just as the car disappeared from view. He told my father that he'd taken to avoiding looking at the windows in the evenings as he'd arrive home since then, especially when it was dark. It was dark enough in the window that he never got a clear look to be able to describe this person. There was nothing that was extraordinary about their appearance. The only thing he could make out was that there was enough movement to suggest that whoever it was, they were anticipating his arrival, and their head always turned to follow the path of the car along the drive. Something else had happened to my father's friend. in the intervening time between his visit and the night where he was showing us around the house. A friend of his from the church, a brother in the order, had visited on an evening. And in the kitchen on the middle floor of the 3-story house, which was, incidentally, where we sat when he told us this story, they'd been catching up over dinner. During the evening, a noise had come from an upstairs room that sounded like a person running from one corner of the building to the other. A heavy noise that sounded like someone bolting through each of the rooms. It was no surprise to my father's friend, he said, that they found no one upstairs when they went to look. But what they did find was that each door in the path was wide open, and in the hallway, high up on the wall, something was written in pencil. V is for visitors, the brother said jokingly. But what had been left on the wall were the initials V and S, the printing of each scratched deep through the old wallpaper of the hall. He showed us this with a torch. It was still scrawled on the wall, before finishing the story and taking us back home. It was a couple of months till I saw my father's friend again. In that time, he'd met the previous owner of the house and in passing had brought up the events from the past few months with her and asked if they had experienced anything strange while they lived there. "Oh, you mean Victor?" she said. Victor is the previous owner of the house. She had lived in the house with her family since the early 60s, and Victor was the owner previous to her who had died in the house. Over the years, they'd had experiences that were unusual, but had gotten used to the idea that they were sharing the house with this previous resident, and she encouraged him to live and let live with Victor, who he now shared the house with. The disturbances from my father's friend died down after that. It seemed that all Victor wanted was for him to just know that he was still there, and in accepting that, Victor was content to exist within his own memories of the house. However, he would still occasionally appear standing in the window, usually at the time of the evening that light is starting to fade, and at the time of the year that the evenings grow short. Even myself, in the years since, walking past the house on an evening, with a void looking through the trees to see the window. Last year, I told this story one night to two friends while we were walking on the path that runs down the hill, down towards the coast. As we walked along the coast road, I got to the point where I told them about Victor writing his initials on the wall, and just at that moment, a street lamp on the road flickered for a second and the light went out. "That must be Victor," my friend said. And now, on the top of the hill as the light faded, I wonder if he heard his name on the hill road that night.
The Ouija board.
It was dark now, and I'd lost track of time. Rather than backtracking my route, I decided to take the quickest way over the hilltop. It was completely desolate, and the path down led through the darkness of the woods. It occurred to me that no one stayed on the hill after dark, and perhaps there was always a fear of what might follow you down. In front of me, I had two choices, and I chose the left-hand path. A couple of minutes later, I was lost. In pitch black, and having drifted from the path, was making my way down through the trees. I knew every path it was possible to take from the hilltop down, but here, without light, it was a different world, and every turn I made seemed to lead me into an area transformed from what I was expecting. Like as if, through choosing the wrong path, I'd stepped into a parallel realm. How could a place so familiar seem so suddenly unfamiliar? The trees themselves seemed denser on the hillside woods, and the branches reaching higher towards the sky, like outstretched knotted hands. The very last light of the evening slipping from between their fingers. In remembering the story of the house, had I invited a presence to join me on the hill? A religious teacher once warned us of the dangers of opening the gate to a world we don't understand. The idea of dabbling with the occult. Although I didn't grow up with any real interest in the church myself, the most fascinating sermons, the ones we'd sit up and listen to, were the ones about the dangers of the occult. It was a discussion about this one summer evening that led us, myself and a group of 3 friends, to make our own Ouija board. Writing out each letter of the alphabet on a piece of paper, which we cut into individual letters and arranged into a semicircle on the floor of an old scout hall we'd hang around in. For a planchette we used a glass, and after a bit of work and assembly, managed to recreate a fair facsimile of the type of board we'd seen in films and books. And in my case, one book in particular. At either side of the semicircle we placed a card that read yes and no, and at the bottom a card that read goodbye. Each of the 4 of us placed a finger on the glass, started moving it around in circles, and in turn each of us asked to the empty hall if there was anything present in the room. After a while of nothing really happening, we'd resorted to acting up, and it was at this point that I felt a pull in the glass, and it moved. It was a slight movement against the circle that in the instant I could barely feel, but it was against the flow of how we were moving the glass. The only way I could describe it now was that it seemed outside of nature, like a flicker of life in an inanimate object. I took a step back from the circle, and I can tell you now, I've never touched a Ouija board since. My friends continued, caught up in the electricity of this. But a few minutes after that, as I stood back watching, my friend asked once more, "Is there anyone there?" And the glass moved to the word yes in the semicircle. I left a few minutes later and went home. But I was there to see the start of what happened, and my friend told me the rest of the story a few days later, with some deliberate omissions. What I saw was this. The board spelled out the word here, and one of my friends asked if it was someone we knew. The glass moved to the word yes, and I immediately left the hall and went home. I'd had enough, and I left the room with this impression that we were being toyed with, and whatever we'd opened the gate to in the hall, we were out of our depth. After I left, it transpired that the board had been the one asking the questions about who they were, where they lived, and the year they were born. But at a certain point, someone had said something that had made whatever was talking to them angry. When they tried to say goodbye, the board had kept them there for hours in the hall, asking questions the whole time. Things, he said, that none of them would ever repeat. And finally, leaving them with the strange message that it would show them how old and powerful a spirit it was. The next evening, a storm blew up that lasted 2 days. And yet, that wasn't the strangest thing to happen. During the day while he was at school, there was a knock on the door of my friend's house. His mother answered, and an old woman, standing at the doorstep of the house, told her that evil was sitting on the roof of the house, and that the house had the smell of death. Then the woman turned from the door and walked down the street, turning once to look back and smile in the direction of the roof of the house. I didn't look back towards the peak of the hill again and made my way down through the darkness of the woods, knowing that I had to keep moving through the trees, but with a feeling that I didn't want to look too far into the darkness around me, until I eventually found the road again. Stepping from a very real and unfamiliar landscape into the reassuring light of the road at the foot of the hill, but with an impression now that I couldn't shake of a form following close behind. The walk to my house took half an hour, and I decided not to pass the old house again on the way back. On reaching a road where I had to stop and cross, something caught my eye for a split second. Something had stepped out of the darkness and quickly back into the shadows, with a strange kind of movement, now pausing to see where I was going next. I crossed quickly and nothing followed that I could see. It could only have been a trick of my imagination, because here I looked back and there was no one on the path behind me.
The Lost Book of Black Magic.
I arrived home one evening with a book about black magic. It was Christmas week, and my parents were in the hallway putting up a tree. My dad asked where I got the book, and then asked to see it. I suppose he'd put two and two together that the book was maybe something that I shouldn't have. After flicking through the pages, he paused, handed it back, and told me that he didn't want it in the house. It was such a strange reaction. I grew up devoting a lot of my time to books, especially horror. And yet there was never anything before that crossed the line of what I could read or, as it did in this case, seemed to set my dad so ill at ease. I borrowed the book from my cousin who lived just around the corner, so I walked back to his house, disappointed that I had to return it. On the way, I had a look through the book. It was a guide to performing black magic, illustrated like the Usborne supernatural guides of the 80s that I'd had for years. But there is something weird about the tone of this particular book. One of the pages I opened was a step-by-step guide to selling your soul to the devil, including a full-page illustration of the contract itself. On another page, a layout for a Ouija board and guidelines of how to use it and who to talk to and what an interaction could offer you. I flicked to a page with a picture of a dying man in a bed, surrounded by demons tugging at the bed sheets, waiting for him to slip from this world. There's an old belief that always stuck in my head, that a demon can jump into your mouth as you yawn, just as you drifted off to sleep. I closed the book and gave it back. I tried to find it since with no luck. I searched every bookstore and every possible reference to an occult book of its sort. And I've never found anything close to how strange it was. I don't remember the name, but I know that it left such an impression that if I saw it again, I'd know it was the book I'd been loaned. The thought that there was something about the book that unsettled my father has meant that I often think about it. The mystery of what was so unusual about it, I suppose, is far scarier than any possible reality. But what kind of book does someone not even want in their house for a single night?
Safe travels.
It's 4 a.m. now, and another 2 hours to daylight. And it's sitting on the stairs outside my room. I arrived home from my walk and went about my regular business for the evening. I went asleep thinking about my walk back from the hill and what I caught, or what I thought I caught, stepping out from the shadows. It couldn't have been anything, I thought. And though it took me some time, I eventually drifted off to sleep. I awoke, and through the open door of my room, I saw its shadow silhouetted against the wall of the stairs. Its form is just out of view, behind the turn of the staircase, but the unmistakable shape of something sitting patiently at the top of the stairs. I'm going to wait for daylight because I have the impression that whatever is there will disappear with the morning light. And yet, what if it realizes now that I'm awake? I could quietly try and move to close my door and sit behind it till dawn. But what happens if its head turns around the corner of the wall, just as I reach the handle? Or if I decide to run, and I feel its hand grip my ankle as I pass it on the stairs? This is if I could move, but I think my plan is to lay here till the sun comes up and hope that it decides to make its way back to the hill. What I keep wondering is, will what's there be back again tomorrow night? That idea again, that a demon would enter your body through the mouth as you drift off to sleep. And who is it on the stairs? Victor? Whatever we invited into the hall on the Ouija board all those years back, or had I, as the light faded on the hill, opened the door to something new and given it an open invitation to follow me back? Look into the darkness.